It is January 10th, 1870, in Cleveland, Ohio. A 30-year-old businessman and his partners incorporate the Standard Oil Company. Over the following years, they expand upon their initial $1 million investment by acquiring smaller oil companies and refineries across Ohio and beyond. By 1890, Standard Oil is worth $100 million and controls over 90% of U.S. oil production. By the time he retires, the company's founder becomes, for better or worse, one of the richest and most influential men in the history of the United States, and indeed, the world. His name, John D. Rockefeller, the world's first billionaire. The man known to history as John D. Rockefeller was born John Davidson Rockefeller on July 8, 1839, in the small town of Richford, New York. The Rockefellers first arrived in North America around 1723, when Johann Peter Rockefeller and his family migrated from the Rhine Valley in western Germany to New Jersey, later relocating to New York State. John's father, William, or Bill, Avery Rockefeller, was a traveling salesman who described himself as a botanic physician or herbal doctor. This was essentially a euphemism for making fake medicines from herbs in his mother's garden and claiming they could cure all kinds of ailments. Quack doctors like him were common in the early 19th century. An all-around con artist, William used the money from selling his so-called remedies to lend money at usurious rates to poor farmers, often with the specific goal of seizing their land when they couldn't repay the debt. He was an unscrupulous character who would later be brought to court for sexual assault and violent conduct involving firearms. In late 1836, while William Rockefeller was wandering through the countryside near Richford, he met Eliza Davidson and charmed her with his wild stories. In February 1837, the two were married, despite the fact that Bill was already engaged to a beautiful but penniless woman named Nancy Brown. Eliza Rockefeller was the youngest daughter of John Davidson. Eliza's father, John Davidson, was a wealthy farmer who lived between Niles and Moravia in New York State, about 30 miles to the north. Eliza's mother had died when she was a child, after taking a pill sold by a man who claimed to be a traveling doctor. Because of this, John Davidson, a Scots-Irish man, was highly suspicious of his daughter's intention to marry Bill Rockefeller. He believed Bill was after the family's money, his wife's death years before. After marrying Bill and moving in with him, Eliza found herself sharing a home with Nancy Brown, the woman Bill had previously been engaged to, now working in the house as a so-called housekeeper. It soon became clear that Nancy's duties extended beyond typical housekeeping. Over the next 2 years, Bill fathered 4 children, 2 with Eliza, a daughter named Lucy, and a son named John, the future oil magnate, and 2 daughters with Nancy. Although Eliza pitied Nancy, and the 2 women maintained cordial relations during Bill's frequent and extended absences, the Davidson family eventually pressured Bill to send Nancy back to her parents, along with her 2 illegitimate daughters. After Nancy's departure, Eliza gave birth to another son, William Jr. With her husband away for months at a time, Eliza managed the household with extreme frugality. When John was 3 years old, the family moved to Moravia, just 3 miles from the Davidson farm. In 1843, Eliza gave birth to another daughter, Mary Ann. In 1845, she had twins, Frank and Francis, though Francis died shortly before her 2nd birthday.
The boys were given adult responsibilities from an early age, something that was common in the 19th century, a time when children as young as 9 or 10 were expected to contribute to the family's finances through some form of work. This early responsibility caused John and William Jr. to mature quickly. John attended the very school his father helped establish. While not particularly brilliant academically, he
showed a natural gift for mental arithmetic. Otherwise, he was a quiet, introverted child, lacking the exuberance of many of his peers. But he was extremely patient, a trait that revealed itself even in simple games like chess or checkers, where he would take his time and calculate every move. He would spend a great deal of time considering every move, an approach that often frustrated his opponents and caused them to lose. This habit of calm, calculated thinking was encouraged by his mother, who herself had many years and reasons to reflect on the impulsive decision to marry the erratic and unpredictable Bill Rockefeller. John also inherited his strong religious faith from his mother, who regularly took her children to the local Baptist church. The 1840s were a period of economic growth and territorial expansion in the United States, and John D. Rockefeller displayed an entrepreneurial spirit that matched the spirit of the age from a very young age. As a boy, he would buy candy by the pound from the store, divide it into smaller portions, and sell it to his siblings for a profit. At just 7 years old, he discovered a nest of turkey chicks in the woods, raised them at home, and sold them. John's early passion for making money was largely influenced by his father, even though he would later come to see Bill's many flaws. As a child, John admired his father as a strong, athletic man who took his children hunting and fishing and entertained them at home by singing songs and playing the violin. Although the family experienced long periods of anxiety during Bill's absences, he always returned bearing generous gifts and large sums of money, gained by both honest and questionable means. Among Bill's more legitimate ventures was a lumber business in Moravia. When John was about 8 or 9, he learned how to select good quality wood for use in the family home. As a businessman, Bill negotiated aggressively and often exploited the ignorance of potential customers. At the same time, he paid generous wages to his workers, honored his debts promptly, and fulfilled his contracts. Later in life, John's business practices would mirror many of his father's, though he managed to avoid the scandals that followed Bill. In 1849, after being indicted for sexual assault, Bill Rockefeller left Moravia. By the spring of 1850, the family had relocated to Owego, near the Pennsylvania border. It was likely around this time that John stopped idolizing his father and began to see him for who he truly was. Soon, he began referring to his mother as a widow, and in his adult life, he avoided speaking about his father altogether. As American settlers pushed westward toward the Pacific, encouraged by the discovery of gold in California, the country remained sharply divided over the issue of slavery. In his school essays, John D. Rockefeller expressed himself as a passionate abolitionist, a cause championed by the newly formed Republican Party. He was also close friends with Mark Hanna, who would later become a powerful Republican Party boss and U.S. Senator from New York. John had dreams of attending university. However, in May 1855, just before his graduation, his father abruptly told him to drop out of school and find a job. This unwelcome news was tied to the secret double life that Bill Rockefeller was leading. For several years, Bill had taken his traveling doctor persona across the frontier into Canada. In 1852, he met and fell in love with a 17-year-old girl named Margaret Allen from Ontario. While courting the teenager, Bill conveniently failed to mention that he already had a wife and 5 children living in the United States. In June 1855, William Rockefeller committed bigamy by marrying Allen. Realizing he could not financially support 2 families, he pressured his eldest son to begin working. After taking a 3-month course at a commercial college, John began his job search in August. He made a list of all the businesses he wanted to work for and visited them in person, asking if they needed a bookkeeper. For several weeks, he had no success. At one point, his father even suggested that John could join him on the road, a dreadful prospect that only motivated John to redouble his efforts. Finally, on September 26, 1855, the small merchant firm of Hewitt and Tuttle hired him as an assistant bookkeeper. For the rest of his life, John would celebrate September 26th as Job Day. He loved the job and paid meticulous attention to detail, examining every bill and invoice thoroughly, accounting for every cent, and ensuring the firm wasn't being cheated by clients. He arrived at the office each morning at 6:30 a.m. and often didn't return home until after 10 p.m. Upon May, beginning his work at Hewitt and Tuttle, Rockefeller also began tracking his personal income and expenses in a red notebook he titled Ledger A. The entries in that ledger reveal that, from the moment he began earning money, Rockefeller was committed to charitable giving. By 1859, he was donating 10% of his income. While he primarily supported Baptist organizations, he also contributed generously to black churches and other charitable causes. John used his financial acumen to save the church by raising $2,000 from the congregation to pay off a demanding creditor. He saw no contradiction between his deep faith and his desire to acquire wealth. Later in life, as a rich man, Rockefeller would openly credit God for his success and fortune. Despite the economic downturn of 1857, Bill Rockefeller was also earning well and decided to build a large house in downtown Cleveland, with the goal of reuniting his first family under one roof for the first time in years. While Bill funded the construction, he left John in charge of supervising the project and handling payments to the contractors. John's success in managing the project seemed to convince his father that he was now ready to take over the role of head of the family. With that, Bill moved permanently to Philadelphia to live with his second wife. Although he would occasionally reappear in John's life over the coming decades, it is ironic that this manipulative father distanced himself from his first family just as his eldest son was beginning a journey that would make him the richest man in the world. Had he known how much money John would soon earn, Bill would undoubtedly have stayed around to try and get his share. In January 1857, after junior partner Henry Tuttle left the firm, Rockefeller was promoted to chief bookkeeper with an annual salary of $500, considerably less than Tuttle's former salary of $2,000. After receiving a modest raise to $600, John began trading commodities on his own account. As the pay dispute continued, he and his English friend, Maurice B. Clark, decided to start their own trading house. In April 1858, they formed a partnership, each contributing $2,000 in capital. John managed to save half the amount, but had to borrow the remaining $1,000 from his father at 10% interest. The venture quickly proved profitable, netting $4,400 in its first year and $17,000 in the second. However, the volatile nature of the commodities trade and the constant need for cash flow to pay suppliers forced Rockefeller to seek additional loans from his father, who had a habit of recalling the debt at the most inconvenient times. John's willingness to make bold, risky deals that often paid off put him at odds with the more cautious Clark. In April 1859, they sought to strengthen their capital by bringing in George Gardner, a former colleague of Clark's. Gardner came from one of Cleveland's leading families and would later serve as the city's mayor. Rockefeller was understandably upset when Clark unilaterally changed the firm's name to Clark, Gardner and Company. He was further irritated when Gardner, shortly after joining, bought a yacht using company funds, a move that symbolized a lifestyle and business approach very different from John's disciplined and modest values. Gardner invited friends, including Rockefeller, on a sailing excursion one Saturday afternoon. But John believed that such indulgences threatened the firm's financial integrity and could compromise its ability to secure credit. Eventually, in late 1862, Gardner withdrew from the partnership, and the company reverted to Clark and Rockefeller. Rockefeller's timing was opportune. He was beginning his business career just as the United States was, entering a period of immense expansion and economic growth. First, the country was physically expanding. The conclusion of the Mexican-American War and the onset of the California Gold Rush in 1848 had opened up the American West. Additionally, mass migration from Europe, where overpopulation had become a pressing issue, brought millions of people to the U.S. aboard the new steamships of the 1840s and beyond, contributing to a massive population boom. In 1850, the U.S. population was about 23 million. By 1880, it had grown to 50 million, and around the turn of the century, it reached 75 million. By the mid-1910s, the population would hit 100 million for the first time. This explosion in the domestic labor force, coupled with a growing market for domestic production, created fertile ground for the rise of new businesses and powerful industrial tycoons. At the same time, the U.S. was entering a more intense phase of industrialization. Although the Industrial Revolution had begun in Britain in the 1770s and gradually spread during the early 19th century, it wasn't until the second half of the 1800s that it truly took off in other nations, most notably in the United States and Germany. All of these developments, rapid population growth, westward expansion to the Pacific, and accelerated industrialization, laid the foundation for the United States to become the world's largest domestic economy by the end of the 19th century. Although Britain remained larger when its vast colonial empire was included, the US was unmatched in internal economic scale. Two additional factors also played into Rockefeller's hands. First, the railway boom of the 1850s and 1860s was beginning to connect the American continent from coast to coast. Second, there was a growing awareness that alternative fossil fuels, beyond heavy coal, could power the American economy. Like all individuals who achieve immense success in business, Rockefeller worked relentlessly and seized the opportunities available to him. But there is no denying that his timing was also extraordinarily fortunate, and it contributed greatly to his rise. In November 1860, at the age of 21, John D. Rockefeller voted in a presidential election for the first time and cast his ballot for Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate. With the Democratic Party divided between its northern and southern factions, Lincoln won the election by securing the support of the northern anti-slavery states. His opposition to the expansion of slavery prompted several southern states to secede from the Union and form the Confederate States of America, leading to the outbreak of the American Civil War in April 1861. Although Rockefeller later claimed he wished to serve the Union cause, he ultimately chose to remain in business to support his family. While both John and his brother William avoided military service by paying $300 each to hire substitutes, their youngest brother, Frank, enlisted in the 7th Ohio Volunteer Infantry and was wounded twice during his service. The disruption of north-south trade routes during the war boosted trade between the East and West via Cleveland, a shift that greatly benefited Rockefeller and his business partners, who profited handsomely. With the capital earned from his commodity trading partnership, Rockefeller began venturing into the nascent oil industry. In the 1850s, America's booming economy had created a soaring demand for lighting, a demand that was quickly outpacing the limited supply of whale oil. While passing through western Pennsylvania in 1853, a New York lawyer named George Bissell observed members of the Seneca tribe using black rock oil for medicinal purposes. The following year, he founded a company and commissioned renowned Yale chemist Dr. Benjamin Silliman to investigate whether this substance, known as rock oil, could be used for lighting and lubrication. Silliman's research confirmed that rock oil, or petroleum, had vast potential. However, Bissell and the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company still lacked a method to extract it efficiently and at scale. In 1856, Bissell had a breakthrough idea: drilling for oil, inspired by the methods used in brine wells for salt extraction. He hired Edwin Drake to carry out the project in Pennsylvania. After several failed attempts, Drake finally struck oil near Titusville in August 1859. It didn't take long before the region was flooded with speculators and laborers, all seeking to strike it rich. Around the same time, a Canadian geologist named Abraham Gesner developed a way to refine petroleum into lamp fuel, which he called kerosene. As the oil boom reached Cleveland, Clark and Rockefeller began handling small shipments of crude oil by 1860. In that same year, Clark's friend Samuel Andrews approached the two men, seeking capital to build an oil refinery. While Clark was skeptical of the idea, Rockefeller was enthusiastic. In 1863, Andrews, Clark, and Rockefeller joined forces with two of Clark's brothers to form a new venture, Andrews, Clark & Co. The company established its operations under the brand name Excelsior Oil Works, building its refinery more than a mile outside downtown Cleveland, but located adjacent to the railroad that connected Cleveland to the Pennsylvania oil fields, which opened in November 1863. Although Clark and Rockefeller initially regarded oil as a sideline to their commodity business, their refinery proved more profitable than the rest of their operations in its very first year. With his financial prospects improving, Rockefeller decided it was time to marry Laura Celestia Spellman, whom he had first met at Cleveland High School more than a decade earlier. An intelligent woman with a business mindset and a member of one of Cleveland's more affluent families, Laura caught his attention. However, Rockefeller did not actively court her until 1862, when she was working as a teacher. Neither was in a hurry to marry, and Rockefeller did not propose until March 1864. After their wedding in September 1864, the couple embarked on a month-long honeymoon, visiting Niagara Falls, Quebec, and New York City. They then moved into a small house just a couple of doors away from the Rockefeller family home. 2 years into their marriage, Laura gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, in August 1866. A second daughter, Alice, followed in 1869 but tragically died just after her first birthday. The family then welcomed 2 more daughters in 1871 and 1872. Finally, in 1874, the couple had their only son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., who, many years later, would inherit his father's fortune. Although several oil refineries had emerged in Cleveland, Rockefeller's was one of the few adequately financed to withstand extreme market volatility. While others treated oil as a get-rich-quick scheme, Rockefeller maintained a long-term perspective. He proposed taking on significant debt to finance rapid expansion, believing that the market would continue to grow. When the conservative Clark brothers, who held the majority vote, blocked his proposals, Rockefeller prepared to break away from them and secured Samuel Andrews' support. In January 1865, when he presented his expansion plans, the Clarks threatened to dissolve the partnership. Accepting this course of action, all parties agreed to hold an internal auction for the company. Rockefeller had lined up backing from several bankers and felt confident he could outbid his partners. The bidding began at $500 and quickly escalated to $60,000, then $70,000. Rockefeller began to doubt whether he could afford such a sum. However, when Clark bid $72,000, Rockefeller immediately responded with $72,500, a bid his partner could not make. That $500 bid was the making of John D. Rockefeller. On February 15, 1865, the new partnership of Rockefeller and Andrews took over operations at the Excelsior refinery. Rockefeller, as the senior partner, was responsible for managing the business, while leaving the scientific and technical aspects to Andrews. Just a few weeks later, the American Civil War came to an end, with General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 12th. The celebrations in Cleveland were soon overshadowed by the assassination of President Lincoln on April 15th. Nevertheless, the return to peacetime conditions would prove beneficial to the emerging oil industry. The end of the Civil War marked not only the triumph of freedom over slavery, but also the victory of industrial capitalism over agrarianism. The war had essentially been a conflict between an urban, industrialized union in the north, and a rural agricultural confederacy in the south. Ohio Congressman and future President James Garfield prophetically remarked, "Oil, not cotton, is king now in the world of commerce." Despite its promise, the oil industry was still in its infancy. Accidents and explosions were common, and fortunes were lost as often as they were made. In December 1865, Rockefeller established a second refinery. American oil soon found its way onto the international market. In 1866, William Rockefeller opened an office in New York City to build relationships with Wall Street bankers and manage the company's exports. Although Rockefeller borrowed heavily during his early years, he earned the trust of bankers by consistently paying his debts on time. This reliability allowed him to access credit during emergencies and survive financial crises that would have bankrupted his competitors. To further pursue his expansion plans, Rockefeller brought in Henry Flagler in 1867, expanding the partnership to become Rockefeller, Andrews and Flagler. 9 years older than Rockefeller, Flagler was also born in upstate New York before relocating to Ohio. The two men first became acquainted in the 1850s when Flagler worked as a grain merchant and Rockefeller served as his agent at Hewitt and Tuttle. As part of the deal, Flagler's stepbrother, Stephen Harkness, one of Cleveland's wealthiest men, Stephen Harkness, Flagler's stepbrother and one of Cleveland's wealthiest men, contributed $100,000 in capital for a 1/3 stake in the business. Rockefeller and Flagler had their desks facing each other and worked together seamlessly. The two men developed a habit of editing each other's letters, which would then pass through the critical eyes of Laura Rockefeller for a third opinion before being sent out. Shortly after joining the partnership, Flagler was placed in charge of the firm's negotiations with the railroads. Transportation was one of the most significant costs in the refining business, and Rockefeller greatly benefited from being close to the oil fields. Located in Cleveland, Rockefeller could transport oil either by water via Lake Erie or by the 3 railroads running through the city, giving him leverage to negotiate the best freight rates. The railroads themselves were fiercely competitive. The Pennsylvania Railroad encouraged firms to move closer to the oil regions by offering low rates, hoping to undermine the Erie and New York Central Railroads, which depended heavily on Cleveland traffic. Jay Gould of the Erie Railroad offered Rockefeller a 75% rebate on transportation costs, while Flagler secured a major discount with the Lakeshore Railroad, part of the New York Central Network. In exchange, Flagler committed to supplying 60 carloads a day, a significant volume that the Rockefeller refineries alone could not fulfill. To meet this commitment, Rockefeller used his market position to coordinate shipments from rival Cleveland firms at preferential rates. Illustrating the railroad's eagerness to close the deal, when Rockefeller claimed he didn't have time to meet Cornelius Vanderbilt, the 74-year-old owner of the New York Central and the richest man in America at the time, Vanderbilt personally visited the 29-year-old Rockefeller at his office. The Lakeshore deal had major consequences for the oil industry, enabling Rockefeller to consolidate his market leadership. By 1869, the Rockefeller Partnership was the world's largest oil refiner, employing 900 workers who produced 1,500 barrels a day, roughly 10% of global output at the time. Not long after the Lakeshore Agreement, John and Laura Rockefeller moved into a brick house at 424 UC Avenue, nicknamed Millionaire's Row because of the grand mansions lining its streets, many of which belonged to Cleveland's wealthiest residents. In this regard, the later decision to establish Rockefeller Center in downtown Manhattan as a highly visible symbol of the family's wealth and power was not driven by John D. Rockefeller himself, but was the vision of his son and heir, John D. Rockefeller Jr., in the 1930s. At their new home on Euclid Avenue, religion continued to play a major role in the family's life. John and Laura Rockefeller avoided attending the theater and the opera. Instead, their 4 surviving children were encouraged to learn musical instruments and formed a quartet that performed regularly at church, which had relocated to Euclid Avenue in 1872 at Rockefeller's initiative. Although John D. Rockefeller took a greater interest in his children's upbringing than many of his peers, the children were primarily raised by governesses and only engaged with the wider society through church. They were taught to be self-sufficient and remained unaware of their father's ever-increasing wealth. Instead, Rockefeller taught them to keep detailed accounts of the income they earned from chores around the house. While Rockefeller had become the market leader in the refining business, the allure of black gold had